Well, thank you, Steve. That was a wonderful introduction. This conference is wonderful. It was great seeing some people here who we've been organizing against Roundup in New York City, and also other people who are fighting against the pesticide spraying all over New York City that was initiated under Rudolph Giuliani as mayor in New York. Then Mayor Bloomberg, another presidential candidate in the news lately, continued the spraying of all over New York City of malathion and pyrethroids to kill mosquitoes. And then it went on now under Mayor de Blasio, and it's continuing. I believe that the glyphosate aspect of that is going to be a subject of a hearing on Wednesday, tomorrow morning, and it looks like we're going to be able to kick out Roundup from New York City parks for the first time. We'll find out tomorrow, but we have a lot of city sponsors on the bill. So how does this go onto the screen over there? Okay. So thanks. So this is, I always start talks with Steve Biko, giving homage to those who came before us. Do people know who Steve Biko was? He was a South African anti-apartheid activist, the founder of the Black Consciousness movement there, who was thrown in prison in South Africa, chained to his cot, such as it was, tortured using cattle prods, electric cattle prods, sold to the South African government at that time by the United States government. And as the leader of the movement there, one of his great quotes was that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And part of, let's think about that for a minute, please. Because one of the things about this talk, will be dealing with the mind of our minds and the minds of the oppressed and how we can break out of some of the formulaic ways of viewing the world and also of viewing our own resistance to it. So thank you, Steve Biko. So the fight against Monsanto's Roundup, The Politics of Pesticides, which is the name of my book, focuses not so much on examining the dangers of each and every pesticide du jour, but on the ways by which corporations such as Monsanto, Bayer, Dow, DuPont, Syngenta, Novartis, and other manufacturers of pesticides and pharmaceutical companies are allowed to mask the truth about their products. Question is, how is it conceivable that despite worldwide medical and environmental exposures of Monsanto's product, Roundup, its dangers and designation as a probable carcinogen, New York is still, under de Blasio, continuing to deploy Roundup to kill weeds, just as governments around the world continue to do everywhere? What the hell is wrong with them? And what can we do about it? And also to think about, I mentioned this last night, what do we mean by a weed to begin with? What do we mean by a pest to begin with? One person's weeds is another person's medicine, organic, natural plant medicine, to deal with many of the issues that we're facing today. So what is a weed? A dandelion is a weed, yet dandelion tree is great for the liver and for, so we're talking about reframing the way we think about things and questioning and not accepting what we take for granted, our hidden assumptions that we don't even think to question often. So in Baghdad, have anybody seen that before? Hasn't been on American TV? That was Donald Rumsfeld, the U.S. Department of Defense Secretary, meeting with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, shaking hands, arranging for the next deal to send weapons and agricultural products to Iraq. It's been wiped out of history. So this was on December 20th, 1983. They make a deal, Donald Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein. Donald Rumsfeld at that time was special envoy of President Ronald Reagan. Later he became Secretary of Defense under George Bush. Iraq was dependent on buying large amounts of grain as well as armaments from the United States, with the billions of dollars in foreign aid supplied by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is what we just saw in the film. We saw John Reed, played by Warren Beatty in the movie Reds, and Diane Keaton playing Louise Bryant in this great movie, in my view, one of the best movies I've ever seen, asking, how is it that we make these deals? Why would people question anything about what's going on in terms of the deals and the governments and everything? And here we just saw Donald Rumsfeld making the deal on behest of the U.S. corporations with Saddam Hussein. 8 years later, the U.S. began bombing Iraq. Rumsfeld had by then returned to his post as chair of Searle Pharmaceutical Corporation, and later as chair of the Gilead Sciences. And just a side note, Gilead owned the patent for Tamiflu. For a while, Rumsfeld profited from the mass selling of Tamiflu all across the United States, which was advertised on TV after 9/11 and especially after the anthrax attacks in 2001. So the link between the U.S. pharmaceutical companies, the people in power, who's making the rules and decisions, all comes as a circle, and they go around there. I call it the revolving door, right, of who's in power, who's making the rules, who's in government, who's in the corporations, and they go round and round. It doesn't matter who's the president. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican. They all do the same thing with the same people. So Rumsfeld returned as chair of Gilead Sciences, and after heading the CIA, President George Bush became a director of pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly, which also helped to bankroll Giuliani's campaign when he was running for president. Lilly was owned by the family, it still is, owned by the family of arch-conservative Vice President Dan Quayle. So what did he say? I forgot his saying, not a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Something like a waste is a terrible thing to waste. What? To lose, right. A mind is a terrible thing to lose. That was Dan Quayle's great quote. So then the West Nile virus was when the virus was first detected in New York City in 1999 under Giuliani, U.S. government officials falsely considered it a bioterrorist attack by Iraq's President Saddam Hussein. Wow. Who remembers that? Nobody. Who supposedly had sent the virus to New York City. This was the only way that we were able to get funds originally to fight against West Nile virus, or to do anything at all around that, was to frame it as a bioterrorist attack, even though every scientist and their mother knew, who we interviewed en masse, knew that it wasn't a bioterrorist attack. This was all ridiculous. It was like a month later, it was pushed out of the press. But they felt that the only way they could get money from the federal government to help New York City at the time was to frame it that way, thus setting in motion a whole way of thinking that has plagued us, I believe, ever since. Here's what the spraying of New York looked like in part from the spray trucks going around the city. This slide was gotten when several of us jumped in a car and chased around the spray trucks as they went, and we tried to cut them off, and other people tried to run up and let the air out of the tires, or people did, and people risked, actually, we didn't realize it at the time how much we were risking. Didn't have gas masks, people just ran up to it and, and tried to block the trucks from poisoning kids, because there were all these children, especially, in the way of the spray, and they didn't care. They just didn't care, and they still don't. They're still spraying by truck, even though we won our lawsuit, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Here's Van Howell did this great drawing. Van Howell from out here on Long Island originally, a great artist. This Mayor Giuliani in his helicopter. And here he is again. It's been in the news a little bit lately, I hear. Hasn't changed at all. In the early 1900s, U.S. Marine Corps commander Smedley Butler, his Major General Smedley Butler, minced no words in reflecting upon his own role in conquering other countries at the behest of the banks and the U.S. corporations. Again, he's the head of the Marine Corps in the United States. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of this country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general. And during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the banks. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I suspected I was just part of a racket at the time. Now I'm sure of it. Like all the members of the military profession, I never had a thought of my own until I left the service. My mental faculties remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of the higher-ups. This is typical with everyone in the military service. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for the American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National Citibank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 and 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. Looking back on it, I feel that I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. People ever hear of this? Of Smedley Butler? Great hero he was a hero of the United States in many ways. First in the Marine Corps, but especially when he came out, he also wrote a book called War is a Racket, and just denounced and looked at U.S. policy and how he was instrumental in being used to take over other countries around the world and to use the land in those countries for U.S. corporations and what was grown on the land for U.S. corporations, as well as the labor and the resources there. In 1934, Smedley Butler, U.S. Marine Corps commander, testified before the U.S. Congress that he had been offered millions of dollars to lead an insurrection and stage a fascist coup against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he named names. The coup was funded by corporate behemoths headed by DuPont and J.P. Morgan. Those names sound familiar? Here's one of his books, The Plot to Overthrow the President, a book about Smedley Butler that came out a couple of years ago. Again, it's down the memory hole of what he revealed, and many other people, is the interrelationship of the U.S. government and U.S. corporations in promoting the takeover of other countries for all sorts of different reasons, and I would argue for genetic engineering as a fundamental aspect of that policy, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. DuPont, let's hear it for DuPont. Better things for better living through chemistry. Great. Let's hear it again. This is what we think of, how we think. Philip's milk of amnesia. We don't remember these things. We never taught these things, or we forget them in the deluge of other stuff that is ultimately insignificant compared to what we are facing and drives what's important out of our heads and out of our lives. So in 1934, Smedley Butler, again, this is it again. I said, let's hear it again, but I'm not going to read it again. You want me to read it again? Okay. In 1934, U.S. Marine Corps Commander Smedley Butler testified before the United States Congress that he had been offered millions of dollars to lead an insurrection and stage a fascist coup against President Franklin Roosevelt. And he named names. The coup was headed and funded by corporate behemoths, DuPont and J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt actually, he knew that he was told this, he found out, he just sat on that information for different reasons, political reasons that were happening at the time, didn't really do anything with that information. So this is my own, what I like to think of, I go, what? Duh. It just blows away some of the things we learn. So I like this slide called mental floss. This is from Occupy Wall Street. No, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. In the last few years, and it's happening right now, DuPont, same DuPont, and Dow merged their extensive agricultural provisions into a new entity called Corteva Agriscience. Syngenta merged with ChemChina. Bayer bought Monsanto for $66 billion. They became the biggest seed company and the largest agrochemical company on the planet, owning and controlling almost 25% of the world's seeds. Add in BASF, and together those four huge corporations own and control 80% of the world's seeds, almost all genetically engineered to withstand particular pesticides like Roundup. Some actually generate pesticides themselves, turning each cell of the plant into a pesticides factory. Those pesticides won't wash off, no matter how much you scrub. They're in each cell. We eat it. And the same companies manufacturing pesticides that are poisoning us also manufacture vaccines and sell us the drugs for treating those diseases that their own chemicals are causing. Think about that. Should we look at it again? Somebody else read it. Read it aloud. So, okay. The same companies so they're sending us complete cycle of, this is by John Jonick. So we have the Acme Chemical Company on the left, Acme Cancer Cure Company in the middle, and Acme Hospital Corp. Trying to show the loop. The economic profits made by those companies are enormous. We must fight to take the profits and private patenting out of all aspects of research, development, manufacture, and marketing of pesticides, GMOs and vaccines. Take it out of GMOs, vaccines, and pesticides, and out of the military, and out of serving the expansive interests of U.S. corporations abroad. Monsanto, people know this, so I'm going over familiar territory here, I believe, because Jeff Smith and everybody else talked about this extensively for many years, and yesterday and the day before as well. Monsanto had engineered its Roundup-ready corn and soy to withstand its Roundup herbicide. For the company, it's a lucrative technological fix where an herbicide is patented and plants are engineered to tolerate that chemical while everything else is destroyed when you spray it. So there's nothing else left standing except that one crop, which allows farmers, and I won't even blame farmers, allows what we call farmers, which is the giant corporate monocropped areas of the world, it allows them to just mass spray over and over and over again because it doesn't really kill the crop. But everything else is gone. Not only do genetically engineered foods poison us directly, the pesticides applied to them poison us a second time. So genetic engineering, my conclusion of this part, is an essential component of the new globalization of capital. And going back to Smedley Butler, here I'm making the claim that genetic engineering is totally necessary for the expansion of capitalism around the world, which capitalism needs to expand, right, corporations, in order to continue to exist in this type of a system. GMOs provide private corporations and the governments they control. GMOs provide private corporations and the governments they control with the means to conquer, patent, and profit from those parts of life that have thus far stood outside of the capitalist control, the inner workings of our living cell, what Vandana Shiva calls biopiracy. As the Monsanto trials currently underway are revealing, the true results in Monsanto's experiments were concealed not only by Monsanto, but by government regulators who are supposed to be protecting us and not corporate profits. Concealed in the Monsanto records are ghost-written research attributed to academics. Stacy Malkin talked about that last night. Proof that senior EPA officials quashed government reviews of glyphosate that would have been conducted by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And that was one of the few things that actually appeared in the New York Times about the documents. Jonathan Latham says, he's the executive director of the Bioscience Research Project and has a chapter on this in my book, as does Stacy Malkin. These Monsanto concealed documents represent a tremendous trove of previously hidden or lost evidence on chemical regulatory activity and chemical safety, heavily focused on the activities of regulators. Time and again, says Jonathan Latham, regulators went to extreme lengths of setting up secret committees, deceiving the media and the public, and covering up evidence of human exposure and human harm. These secret activities extended and increased human exposure to chemicals they knew to be toxic, which is why the juries now are coming out heavy against Monsanto over in 3 trials now, and the 4th one is now underway. 3 trials, they won. One trial won $750 million. Another trial won $2 billion against Monsanto. And then I forget what the 3rd one went, and now the 4th one is underway. And now they're trying, and Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, is trying to, our friendly aspirin company, Bayer, is trying to manufacture, they're trying to come up with a way of, so that they don't have to pay out all these billions of dollars, and to set up a pool and there are now 20,000 lawsuits that have been filed against Monsanto, and maybe 100,000 people part of that, potentially, and facing over $1 trillion in fines. And the juries have been outraged at Monsanto because of these hidden documents. It's not just that these poisons affect people, but how Monsanto knew this, and so did the US government. And they lied about it, covered up, worked in secret together. That's what these documents are now showing. And we wouldn't have known that without the trials, even though we suspected it, but we wouldn't have gotten all the documents without these trials that are now underway. So the first case that came to trial against Monsanto was heard just a year and a half ago. It seems like a decade ago by now. The plaintiff's name was Dwayne Johnson. He suffered from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma caused by Monsanto's Roundup. His legal team presented documents that Monsanto had been keeping secret, which revealed government collusion with Monsanto. The jury voted unanimously to award Johnson, who is a school groundskeeper, $250 million in punitive as well as actual damages. And Johnson is a real hero. This is Dwayne Johnson. Maybe we could give him a round. Monsanto's own scientist, Donna Pharma, informed the company that you cannot say, this is a quote from her, that you cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen. We have not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement. The testing on the formulations are not anywhere near the level of the active ingredient glyphosate. So in other words, they tested glyphosate, which is poison, but they didn't even do the testing on the rest of Roundup, which now we're finding out includes POEAs, which is surfactants, and also now arsenic inside Roundup. As a result of the judgment in favor of Johnson and subsequent plaintiffs, there are currently, as I said, 100,000 plaintiffs who have signed to file lawsuits against Monsanto, alleging that the exposure to Roundup caused them or their family members to become ill with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a form of cancer, and that Monsanto suppressed that research. New cases are coming to trial. Bayer, now responsible for $1 trillion in Roundup-related lawsuits, is seeking to settle all of them from a fund that might cost Bayer $8 billion, which is a bargain for Bayer because it's only around 12.5% of what it paid to buy Monsanto. One attorney, Mike Miller, on our side, is holding out, convinced that injured plaintiffs deserve much more than what they would get from these type of settlements, and his resistance to settling with Bayer could either scuttle or end up strengthening the proposed deal. We don't know which way it's going to go. But that's what's happening right now, today. I mean, today the trial is going on, literally, in St. Louis. Although they are trying to suspend it, they adjourned it so that they can try and get the settlement together. Despite what we have been led to believe, neither pesticides nor genetically engineered agriculture are needed, even if they would work, which they don't, to assure the world's food supply. This is a myth promulgated by the industry and government. While it doesn't increase, Jeff Smith made this point last night. Look, he answered in one sentence. It doesn't increase crop yield. This is a lie. And then he sat back down. Right? Right. We don't need all these words. But it shows, in a larger context, factory farming that it promotes and the monoculturing that it promotes are the ways in which the GMO pesticides industry uproots the commons and steals the resources of the global South and Africa, reminiscent of the European ruling class's theft of the silver and gold extracted from South America during the conquest of the New World. And in 1492, the indigenous people discovered Christopher Columbus on their beach. This is the cover of Eduardo Galeano's great book, The Open Veins of Latin America, where he just goes into the mining of silver and the conquistadors. Also, I might add Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States. The very first chapter is loaded with heart-wrenching information about what happened to the American Indians following the arrival of conquerors from Europe, starting in 1492 and going on for a couple hundred, 300 or 400 years. So monocropping, as we know, facilitates diseases, allows them to spread quickly across entire fields. Right, so you have a field that has only one crop, nothing in between the rows. Farmers know you don't grow crops that way, but corporate farming doesn't care because they have these huge amount of resources, and now they could just spray over a whole field so that you don't kill other plants, except you don't kill the crops that you want to pick. You kill everything else in the field, and monocropping facilitates that. Here's a protest in Washington Square Park in New York on Millions for Monsanto Day. There have been marches every year called Millions for Millions Against Monsanto. Sorry. In Argentina and Brazil, huge swaths of primeval rainforest are being cut down to enable genetically engineered soy to be monocropped for animal feed and biofuels exported to the US, Japan, China, and Europe. One of the main opponents of the use of biofuels, of growing crops to extract fuels from corn especially, or sugarcane, one of the main opponents of that was surprisingly Fidel Castro. Again, nobody learns that Fidel Castro was a lead, for the last 20 years of his life, was a leading environmental advocate and opponent of these giant corporations. Not only are the corporations as capitalists, but scientifically and ecologically. And it was quite amazing because nobody knew that either. In Indonesia, millions of acres of forest have been burned for palm oil production, for mining, and for cattle grazing. In Mexico, the Lacandona Forest, the home of the ancient Mayan people, and the Zapatista Rebellion, which is located there as well, is under siege by international paper companies as much as by federal troops. The planting and importing of GMOs are banned only in 7 countries: Nigeria, Bhutan, Kyrgyzstan, Madagascar, Peru, Venezuela, and Russia. Russia being the most populous country to ban both the cultivation and importation of GM crops. So, U.S. hands off Venezuela. It gives a whole new dimension to another aspect of what's involved here. And here's it says, if you can't read it, this is Vladimir Putin. He said, Russia needs to, this is the people who put this together, said, Russia needs to protect the citizens from GMOs. People should be protected from harmful products or products that have unidentified and unforeseen consequences for humans, especially when used for food. This one he got right. Maybe for the wrong reasons, maybe for the right reasons, but they banned it in Russia. I think the main reason for that is because they want to compete with the United States in agriculture so they could sell GMO-free and organic food. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger approves of the IMF structural adjustment and USAID programs. He once, which is the main source for genetic engineering and pesticides around the world, he once portrayed American aid this way: to give food aid to a country just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. Kissinger is the instrument, the person who helped manufacture U.S. foreign policy for 5 decades now. And to think that he's right in what he says here. Not morally right, but he's right that this is what U.S. aid is about. It's about ways of taking over land in other countries, booting people off their land. We're not giving them food aid to feed them. We're giving it for other reasons. So for Kissinger, food is to be used as a weapon in the achievement of U.S. foreign policy objectives. And so the United States systematically dumps cheap, genetically engineered products saturated with pesticides on foreign markets, undermining local producers and forcing them to purchase the patented seeds from the company manufacturing them. They're not allowed to replant them, along with the pesticides needed to kill off the plant's competitors. Driven from their lands, local producers become dependent on the United States and its corporations, and a number of them try to flee across the border to the United States. On the other hand, people know Anthony Bourdain, the world-famous chef who died, was it last year? I'm not going to speculate here for the purposes of this talk. He wrote, once you've been to Cambodia, and who knew this about Anthony Bourdain? Once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands. You will never again be able to open a newspaper and read about that treacherous, prevaricating, murderous scumbag sitting down for a nice chat with Charlie Rose and attending some black tie affair for a new glossy magazine without choking. Witness what Henry did in Cambodia, the fruits of his genius for gamesmanship. And you'll never understand why he's not sitting in the deck in The Hague next to Milosevic.